Hey guys, so today in the greenhouse we are talking about growing mulberry trees and which are best suited for your climate, environment, and zone. But this is an amazing tree, whether you're choosing the red, the white, or the black mulberry. I'm going to go over every how-to trick and tip I can tell you about growing them, propagating them, pruning them, and keeping them as healthy as possible, from whether or not they can be grown in containers or they need to be grown in open ground areas. So let's get through every step of the way so you can maximize the chance of growing a mulberry tree successfully. Now, mulberries, if they're planted in open ground, they can become quite large. So you need to take into account whether or not you're planning on planting one mulberry tree or multiple, because some varieties may need a pollinator, and that's one of those things that you need to take into consideration. So just remember, not all mulberry trees are self-pollinating. Some will need a secondary tree as a pollinator. This one is self-fertile and self-pollinating, so I'm only going to plant this one, but I'm going to keep it in a very large container so I can move it around the garden with the assistance of a dolly. So this mulberry has been growing in this cloth bag container for a couple of seasons, and you can see it's done really well. It started out really small and it's just multiplied in size. But I'm going to put it in a much larger container so I can leave it in that container for several years and allow it to get much larger. At some point in the future, I might decide to put it in the ground, but as my plans are right now, I plan on just allowing it to grow inside of that large pot. So I do plan on bringing this mulberry back into the greenhouse and keep transferring it back and forth throughout the seasons. So, but if you're not able to do that, you might want to consider putting it in a large clay pot or a large wooden pot to better insulate. And you can also put hay or pine straw around the pot just to add for extra insulation, just to keep it from getting frost damage around the perimeter of the pot. And you can also put quite a large layer of hay or straw on top of it also to prevent any frost damage from occurring. So later in the video, I'm going to show you the exact soil mixture I want to do for this mulberry tree, but you want to make sure that your pH is between 5.5 and 6.5, as it prefers a little bit more acidic soil. I'll give you the exact recipe and also some amendments to add to the soil to get it to that exact right pH. So when the pH is right, it will allow the mulberry tree to grow, pull its nutrients into its root system a lot easier. Now, if you are planning to plant your mulberry in open ground and your soil is too acidic, you can bring that down with lime. But if it's too alkaline, you can bring it up with peat moss. And that is one thing that I always recommend is peat moss. A lot of people don't like to use it, but I think it's just a great product for keeping that acidity at just the right level. If you don't want to use peat moss, you can also use sulfur. Now, mulberry trees are going to need a minimum of 6 hours of light each day, sunlight each day, and 6 hours is a minimum. 8 hours would even be better. So it's basically a full sun tree. You also want to plant it somewhere where there's good air circulation. You don't want to put it in the corner next to a house where there's just not going to be good airflow, because that will cause fungal diseases. So an open area where it gets nice airflow is really important, and that will prevent those fungal diseases from happening. Also, you want to provide a little bit of protection if your area that you live in is really strong winds. Maybe plant it near a windbreak to help any damage that might occur. If you do have a lot of strong winds, you might want to consider staking around the tree with 3 stakes and then tying it off to make sure that it doesn't blow over and damage the tree and separate it from its roots or heavily damage the base of the tree. Now, proper drainage is essential for the mulberry tree, whether you're planting in open ground or in a pot. You want to make sure it's well draining, and that's why one of these meters can also act, well, this one specifically acts as a moisture meter, and I can put it down in the soil to find out if it's wet, dry, or just right. So that's one thing to remember. If you plant it in open ground, you can do a water test before a drainage test before you plant it. Fill the hole with water, and if it doesn't drain out in 30 minutes, then your area that you're planting is going to be too soggy. It's not a well-draining soil. So that's one thing to remember. Mulberries do not like to stand in water, and it will suffer root rot if you plant it in some type of situation like that. Now, another note on watering is to water at the base of the plant to avoid any of the leaves getting wet if you're using tap water to water. Rainwater, this may not be as much of an issue, but tap water sometimes can cause issues with a plant. So watering right at the base of the tree is a lot better, and it's going to prevent any fungal diseases that might come out on the leaves. I've got a video talking about something you can use in the garden that's all natural, and you can use it to prevent and kind of slow down any fungal diseases that might happen. I'll put a link to that video as well. But that's just one thing to remember about watering. Don't overwater, and try to water just at the base of the tree. Now, what I like to use for mulch is a product called soil conditioner. You get it at Lowe's in America and other countries. It's just a very finely shredded pine bark. You can also use pine straw or regular straw, but just put a good 2 to 3 inch layer around the plant, and remember not to put it within 2 inches of the base of the tree, and that will help any rot issues from happening if it stays too consistently moist right where the mulch meets the tree. So fertilizing your mulberry tree at the beginning of the season, I usually recommend starting with a well-balanced, slow-release fertilizer, and this is a really good product, Osmocote. I use it on a lot of bonsai and a lot of things in the garden. It's just a nice, steady release, slow fertilizer. But if you want to really boost up your mulberry berry production, then I always recommend Bloom Plus because it has a high, very high phosphorus count, and it will really make a difference. My azaleas have gone crazy this year because I did 2 waterings in the middle of summer, and now that they're encore azaleas, they bloom a second time in the fall, and they've done amazingly well with Bloom Plus. So I always recommend that product if you're wanting to really produce berries or vegetables or anything like that. That Bloom Plus makes a big difference. Now, if you're resistant to using these types of fertilizers, you can go the organic, all-natural route, and the bone meal has got a really good phosphorus count in it, so you can put that based upon the manufacturer's recommendations. You can put that around the plant, mix it into the soil. Also, you can use something like black cow manure in the yellow bag you get at the big box stores, and you can put a good layer of that on each year at the beginning of the growing season if you don't want to use the fertilizers. But I think you're really going to miss out on berry production by not using those. But anyways, it all depends on your personal preference. Now, about fertilizing, you don't want to do that late in the season in the autumn because the nitrogen could get it to start producing more leaves, and that could be susceptible to winter damage. So you want to do this at the beginning of the growing season, throughout the growing season, but as autumn approaches and it's going to slow down its normal life cycle, just remember, don't add fertilizers in September, October, because that could be a problem, and you could have some frost damage if you're leaving your mulberry outside or if it's planted in the ground. So about pruning, one of the best times to prune is going to be late winter, and you want to remove any dead, diseased, or non-productive branches. And also, if you have any branches that are crossing each other, you want to remove those because you want to open up the canopy and allow good airflow and prevent any future fungal problems. So just remember, you want an open tree that has a lot of branches going out in different directions and have a little bit more lateral growth rather than horizontal growth, because once it gets really tall, it's going to be hard to harvest above 8 or 9 feet without a ladder. So one thing you want to consider when it comes to pruning, if your canopy of the tree becomes too dense and sunlight cannot reach down below the canopy, that's when you're going to really want to thin that to help with the sunlight reaching lower branches and allow more fruit production along the tree that's easier to reach. But anyways, you don't want the tree becoming huge because it's going to become too hard to manage unless you're just wanting it as a shade tree. Now, I have a video about aphids and spider mites, an organic way to get them under control, which could attack your mulberry. So just remember, there's an alternative way to do it other than strong pesticides, which I would never recommend putting on a tree where you're planning on consuming the berry, the vegetable, whatever it is. Try to always go with the organic method first, and then as a last ditch resort, maybe using something else. But I think you're going to have success with this recipe. I'll link it up above, but I would do that first if you are having a problem with your mulberry tree and insect problems. Now, one of the things I would highly recommend doing is planting a companion plant that attracts pollinators, such as a butterfly bush. You'll have all these bees and other pollinators coming into that, and also they'll find their way to the mulberry tree. So that's one of those things that will really aid in, even though they're self-fertile, going from flower to flower can also help boost the production. So just remember, a good companion planting with some type of flowering shrub or bush will ultimately help your mulberry. Now, during the stage when the fruit is starting to develop on your mulberry tree, you might take a 5-gallon bucket, because you want your mulberry tree during that stage to be well watered. Take a 5-gallon bucket and put a very small hole in one corner of it on one side, maybe a 1/16 bit or smaller, and where it'll have a slow drip effect. If you don't have an irrigation system or you don't have a regular watering schedule, this will slowly water it. You can put the lid on it and allow it to drain over a period of a day or even longer, depending how big that hole is. So just remember, you want it to be well watered during fruit development. Now, about harvesting your mulberries, once you get to that stage, you want to make sure you wait until they're fully ripe on the tree because they do not continue ripening once they've picked. And also you want to make sure you don't pick them before they ripen because unripened mulberries can have a certain level of toxicity to them. If you're lucky enough to have a mulberry tree that's quite large and it's just covered in berries, then one easy way to harvest those berries is to put a large tarp under the tree and then shake the tree and allow the mulberries to fall directly onto the tarp. And you can hold the tarp up a little bit off the ground so the mulberries don't have quite such a long distance to fall and end up splattering if they're overly ripe on your tarp, which can leave a lot of staining on you as well as everything around them. Now, as far as winterizing a small tree in a pot, you want to make sure you protect it from extreme colds. Once it goes into the ground, there's not a lot you can do other than piling up a lot of extra straw or mulch around the base of the tree to protect it from those extremely cold winter weather. So the root ball is where you can have your damage. Of course, you could have damage up in the tree as it's a young tree, but just remember protecting that root ball is so important. If you can bring it into a garage or basement or even a greenhouse like this, that's going to help it get through the winter, and you can kind of transfer it back and forth as long as it's small. Once it becomes too large, then protecting it maybe with burlap might be a better thing to do. So even though it's in a dormant state in the wintertime, you want to remember that the root ball still needs a certain level of water. You're going to reduce your watering schedule, but don't let it completely dry out. And that's where a moisture meter is going to really help you, especially if you bring it into a basement or garage. You want it sitting in a humidity tray so you can keep it there just a bit. You can keep there being just a little bit of moisture in the root ball. So that's so important that the root ball doesn't completely dry out. Now, what I'm planning to do with this mulberry tree is just to keep it growing in pots for quite a while and use cuttings from it to propagate other mulberry trees that will eventually end up in open ground. But every 3 years, if you're planning on keeping it in a pot, you want to remove it from the pot and do a root pruning across the base and around the perimeter of the root ball about 1/2 an inch to 1 inch maximum, and that will reduce the root ball size. That's a very common thing that we do in the bonsai world, so it's also really helpful for the plant. We're always worried about pruning the root ball, but we often prune the top without even thinking about it. So pruning the root ball stimulates growth, and it's going to help your mulberry tree retain its vigor and health. So don't be afraid to do that about every 3rd year. Now, another unusual practice that a lot of people might be afraid to do is called defoliation. In the early part of the growing summer season, you might totally remove all leaves and cut back the branches severely, and that can actually help produce more fruit. It gives the tree a signal that it needs to put out more growth, and it will really make a huge difference in your berry production. So some people are afraid to do that, but as long as you don't do it in the heat of summer or the worst time of year when it's just too hot, that's going to help your tree, believe it or not. So as far as that, what I mentioned about root pruning in that 3rd year, another thing that you want to consider doing is going up a pot size larger, or maybe even doubling your pot size to help the growth. When you do that, use a homemade soil mixture, and I'll show you up above exactly how to make your own premium potting mix, because that is going to save you up to 75% off the cost of your potting soil. So it's just a good idea to remember when you're doing that root pruning, consider going up to a pot size, and I'm going to probably double the pot size once the 3-year mark has came for this tree. Now, one trick you can do to increase fruit size and fruit production is to prune off half of your fruit during the growing season, and then the energy from the entire tree will be focused on those existing berries. So that's an interesting thing to do when it's manageable and before your tree becomes huge and starts producing massive amounts of berries. But in the early stages, reducing half of the fruit early in the growth cycle there will produce more fruit and bigger fruit. It's hard to believe, but that's one of those things that really helps the tree put energy into each berry. So there are basically 3 types of mulberry trees, the most common types. And the first one is a red mulberry. It produces a reddish, almost black fruit, and it will fruit between April and August, depending on where it's planted, what the climate is. And that is a very well-tasting sweet mulberry. The second type is a white mulberry. Now, the white mulberry originated in China, and it has a white to pink to almost red color to it, and those will bloom late spring and early summer. The third type of mulberry is the black mulberry, and it will produce fruit from late summer to early fall. Now, the black mulberry has a little bit slower growth pattern, which makes it better for confined garden spaces, but it will gain quite some size over time. But again, its growth habit is a little slower. Now, mulberries will fruit on old and new wood, so unless it's a diseased branch, you want to be careful about cutting off too many branches because you might be cutting off future fruit production. Now, as far as ultimate growth size, once it reaches maturity, your white and red mulberries can reach anywhere from 30 to 50 feet. So that's something to take into account, is if you have a limited amount of space or you don't want a super large tree, you don't want to go with white or red. Go with the black because its size is going to be about 20 to 30 feet. Now, after speaking about the massive sizes these trees can get to, you also have to remember there are dwarf varieties, but they can be a little bit harder on supporting their fruit, so it may require trellising for those smaller dwarf varieties. So if you're growing it on a balcony or on a patio or limited space garden, the dwarf variety is the one you're going to want to specifically look for to keep it at a manageable size, and especially if you're going to grow it in containers long term. So while you're growing your mulberry tree, you want to know some of the diseases that can attack your mulberry tree and cause problems along the way. Now, one of the first ones is powdery mildew. You'll see powdery spots on there. You can have leaf discoloration, reduced fruit production, and you want to use something that's natural for that as well. And I have some, I'll link a video up above on a thing that will help with some types of diseases. But if you have to, use a sulfur-based product, and that will help with powdery mildew. Now, as your tree grows, canker diseases can possibly become a problem, and when you go to remove those, you want to make sure you sterilize your cutters with something like this. This is just common Listerine, or actually it's this generic form of Listerine I get from the dollar store. So make sure if something like this happens and you see a dead bark area on the tree, it could be a sign of canker disease, and when you go to remove it, before you go and cut healthy branches and do normal pruning, make sure you sterilize from removing the dead branch to going on to the next set of branches, and make sure you destroy that branch and remove it, burn it, but get it away from the tree so that it doesn't spread to the rest of the tree and ultimately could possibly kill the tree. So leaf spot can also be a possible problem. You'll see brown, yellow, or black spots on your leaves, and they're often encircled with a yellow halo around those spots. You also want to use fungal control because it is a fungal issue when you see that. So as far as insects attacking, I mentioned that earlier, but I failed to mention Japanese beetles, which are something that can also attack mulberry trees. They're very common here in the South in Zone 7A. You can buy a Japanese beetle trap that has a pheromone attractant, and they'll go right into a little plastic bag and you can dispose of them. I'll link one of those down below, but that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, aphids, spider mites, and mulberry flies can also be a problem. If you have that problem, make sure you pick up the fruits off the ground if you want to keep fruit production healthy, because the maggots on the ground eating your mulberries can develop into flies, and it can become a huge problem for that particular tree. Now, if you clean up the leaves from the base of the tree, that can also help with diseases and other pest issues. Just come in with a leaf blower or a rake and remove as much of the leaf and keep a nice layer of mulch under the tree. But mulberries are pretty good at fending off diseases and insects as long as they're kept healthy through proper nutrition, proper irrigation, and close management of the tree itself. So that's one thing to remember, is that the tree is not as complicated as maybe I've made it sound to be, as keeping it disease-free and problem-free. But you're going to enjoy having a mulberry tree. It's an amazing tree. So guys, I'm going to show you how to take a cutting from a mulberry tree so you can produce as many mulberry trees as you want to. These type of cups are basically just like a Starbucks cup, and it comes with its own lid, and you can tape the top to maximize humidity. The soil that we like to use is a mixture of 50% peat and 50% perlite, so that way it's going to be really well draining and it'll be the perfect soil. Also, at the bottom of this cup, I'm going to put in just a little bit of aquarium gravel so that the water can settle down there and it can have a wicking action back and forth to our cutting to make sure it remains moist. But also, with the top taped on, it will maximize humidity as well. But we're going to take a cutting from a young branch with really we need 3 nodes or 3 areas where leaves are coming out on that branch. So I'm going to take the highest branch and take a cutting from that. Now, I've taken a cutting from the top of the mulberry tree that's this year's growth, and it has about 3 or 4 nodes. I've removed all the leaves along those nodes, and I've taken the top 2 leaves and I've cut those in half. So we have a very small cutting, about 6 to 8 inches in length. I've added the aquarium gravel to the bottom of our Starbucks type cup. Now I'm going to mix our perlite, equal parts perlite and peat, and I'm just going to mix that well. I'm going to shake it up before we water our plant. Sorry, that may be making a little bit of noise there. And now I'm going to carefully add that to our cup, filling it about halfway. We have to have room for our planting, and I'm going to put this about 1 inch into the soil. Now, I want to make sure that this cutting is at a steep 45-degree angle, and I need to get a sharper pair of scissors there. I'm going to do that at a sharp 45-degree angle. These are ultra sharp, and I'm going to put that in the soil and make sure I water it straight away. And I'm going to put the top on, and one thing I'm going to do initially is I want to put some tape on there to maximize humidity. So once we water it, there'll be a lot of humidity inside of the cup, but that's the easy way to take a mulberry cutting and propagate it to a new tree. And you can do this process over and over, and you can have as many mulberry trees as you like on your property. Now, you want to keep your cutting out of direct sunlight, because your mini greenhouse will become a mini heater, and it will dry out your new cutting, and it will not survive very long. But give it about 2 to 3 months, and then gently remove, or try to remove it by tugging on the tree, and see if it's got a root formation started down below. If it does, it may be time to move it to a larger container that's not requiring the humidity dome. So just remember that. Give it about 2 to 3 months for that process to take place. So guys, in the description below, I'm going to put a list of different types of mulberry trees and which ones are self-fertile, which ones grow best in which zones, and that'll help you make a decision on which one you want to plant in your own yard. So guys, a final note about self-fertile mulberry trees: even though they can produce their own fruit without a pollinator, having a pollinator in the local environment close by can increase your fruit production, and that's really something you want to consider doing. So if you have room and you can plant a second or third tree, that's going to be even better. I'm planning on continuing to propagate and add to my collection of mulberry trees, and just kind of see what happens over the years and how well they produce fruit. So guys, I want to say thanks so much for watching. It's been a rainy day outside the greenhouse, and there's been a lot of noise on the roof of the greenhouse. So I'm hoping my mic was able to cancel that out. But anyways, I want to say thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. And if you have any questions or comments, or if I left something out, please leave a note down below and let me know what I did. So anyways, have a great day.